Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all so much for attending both virtually and in person. I'd like to start off by first acknowledging the stolen land upon which we're on, the Gairo Nation, and bearing the relevance of all this to Dr. Lawrence's talk. I'd like to keep that in mind, especially with regards to the intent, purpose, and action that should accompany land acknowledgements, as opposed to transforming decolonization into a metaphor. This talk is obviously part of the Global Racial Justice program at Einaudi. I have to express also my great thanks to Scott Beamer, Derek Lee, as well as Dr. Rachel Betty Riedel for all the support in terms of organizing this, and again, for all the virtual attendees online as well for being present. So Dr. Bonita Lawrence teaches in the Indigenous Studies program at York University in Toronto, Canada. She is Mi'kmaq with a Canadian and English background as well. Her research and publications have focused primarily on urban and non-status identities and federally unrecognized Aboriginal communities. She's the author of Fractured Homeland, Federal Recognition and Algonquin Identity in Ontario, UBC Press 2012, and Real Indians and Other Mixed Blood Urban Native People and Indigenous Nationhood, by the University of, or published by the University of Nebraska Press, as well as UBC Press in 2004. I'd like to thank very much Dr. Bonita Lawrence for coming to speak to us about the importance of decolonizing anti-racism, particularly given how Indigenous people and settler colonialism in general tends to be elided in anti-racist conversations. And hopefully she'll be able to address some of the questions and more that have been laid out insofar as what are the bridges that can be built between Indigenous people and people of color, Black people, and struggles against racism, social exclusion, poverty, racialization, police violence, as well as through shared mutual histories of settler colonization and dispossession. Is it possible to think of anti-racist politics that is devoid of anti-colonial politics? Perhaps even I would ask decolonial politics. In what ways do extant imperial and colonial forces operate differently towards these communities in terms of necropolitics, or the politics of death, in determining who's invited into the realm of social life and who instead is confined to social death? This question, amongst many, who must die so we may live, is central to our discussion on the theme of decolonizing anti-racism. And with that, I leave it to you, Dr. Lawrence. Again, thank you so much for making the time and for all your labor to come and to speak and to teach us today.
Well, Alan, Mohammed. Ndel Bonita Lawrence, Mi'kmaq Nanin. My Mi'kmaq ancestry comes from two great-grandfathers. However, when my mother was growing up, their family, although mixed bloods, were part of the handful of Mi'kmaq families who stayed in Shediac, New Brunswick, after the reserve was taken back by the government in 1895. Pressures from white society meant that everybody eventually moved to Eskasoni, but my mother, with an Acadian father, ended up in Moncton, where he could work on the railroads. And since my mother and her brothers and sisters all grew up landless and jobless in the Maritimes, which is a depressed region in Canada, they all left seeking work in the US or Canada. So I grew up in Montreal, and that's just a little bit about who I am. And I want to thank the Einaudi Center for International Studies for inviting me to this event. And I've been asked to speak about decolonizing anti-racism, and I'm going to speak first of all about Canadian context, because sometimes things become clearer when viewed in a different context. So in 2005, Einaudi Dua and I had an article published in a journal called Social Justice entitled Decolonizing Anti-Racism, written at a time when anti-racism in Canada completely disregarded Indigenous peoples and their relationships to land. The article's main premise was that by virtue of disregarding Indigenous realities, anti-racist theorists and activists were complicit with settler colonialism in Canada. The article, although now 16 years old, had a significant effect in Canada. We've been in contact with countless numbers of academics and activists of color, primarily South and East Asians, who after reading the article began questioning their diverse communities' relationship to colonialism in Canada. So much that in 2015, at our 10th anniversary, a conference was organized to address its implications. Now, there's a number of reasons why this article was taken so seriously in Canada, and I fear it would not make a dent in the US. So I'm going to discuss the Canadian context first. First, there's the anomalous nature of slavery in Canada. From 1600 till about 1780, fully 2/3 of all Indigenous peoples, fully 2/3 of all enslaved peoples were Indigenous, a product of the Carolina colony's thriving trade in Indigenous slaves, as well as the fur trade. And while a New France edict ruled that slavery was passed on from mother to child in both Native and Black slavery, the reality is that plantation slavery was not possible with a climate such as Canada's. With a growing season, the parts of Canada that are the 37th parallel, our growing season with any luck is April to October. And you can't have the economies of a plantation slavery in that. It's just not economic, you know. So because of that, large-scale chattel slavery didn't develop here. Instead, slavery was personal and corporate, and of necessity on a much smaller scale than in the US. Only around the 1790s, when enough loyalists migrated north after the American Revolution, bringing their African slaves, did Africans significantly outnumber Native people for the final 40 years until slavery was abolished in British colonies in 1833. And in 1867, and it's rather an important part, when Canada was formed, immigration became whites only for the next 100 years. This meant that this relatively small body of Black and Native slaves in existence in the 1830s was erased. Now, of those who didn't die in captivity, those who were freed in 1833 may have intermarried with other Native people or joined the East Coast pre-Confederation Black communities or the Southern Ontario Black communities that formed from the Underground Railroad. However, it happened. While some individuals may be able to trace their ancestry to somebody enslaved in Canada, there's no community of peoples formerly enslaved by Canada. So the question of slavery in Canada was not large enough to displace attention from indigeneity. Secondly, in the 1960s, immigration was liberalized, so large numbers of people emigrated from the Caribbean, Pakistan and India, from East Asia, so that cities like Toronto became 70% of the population composed of relatively new and mostly racialized immigrants. With such large-scale immigration from the global South, Canada had to establish an official multiculturalism policy. In a sense, both to give peoples of color some sort of stake in Canada, which had been whites only for a century, and in the process to effect certain controls on their actions, to allow cultural expression, for example, but not political power. In this racist context, many racialized people saw anti-racism as belonging to them. It was the only space where they could address their issues. It was theirs. And for most people of color, as newer immigrants to Canada, they didn't know anything about Indigenous peoples and didn't really care. And for some, such as Dion Brand, she theorized that perhaps Black people and other peoples of color did not want to consider Native empowerment for the basic reason that they were afraid Native peoples would only provide another hurdle for them to deal with in order to find a place of belonging in Canada. So racialized immigrants framed anti-racism with their concerns in mind. At the same time, the influence of American anti-racism, where race primarily means Black, had entered the discourse as well. But it brings us to the third and main reason why a focus on decolonizing anti-racism had an effect in Canada. And that's because recognized Indigenous peoples are currently somewhere between 5 and 8% of the population, depending on how you're counting it. What this means is, first of all, Indigenous people are visible in Canada. And secondly, it allowed for the theorizing of Canada as a settler colonial state, as theorists such as Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Veracini have addressed, that in settler colonial states, territorial acquisition is the primary goal. And this always means, as Wolfe put it, the elimination of the Native, either through actual murder, through legislation designed to ensure that Native communities are deprived of land and therefore cannot thrive, to have their identities legally regulated in ways that affects legal diminishment, and are targeted through destruction, through the outlawing of ceremonies and even dancing, which in Canada only ended in 1951. We didn't even have powwows till 1951. My apologies, I think I got muted somehow. Can you hear me now? Okay, so the residential school system in Canada only began being dismantled in the 1970s and 1980s, and the last residential school only closed in 1994. The other thing about Canada that isn't often well known is that Canada only paid half the amount per capita for each student in a residential school than the US paid in their boarding schools, which is why up to 50% of children in some instances died in the schools. And that's why the massive unearthing of graves on residential schools, which despite thousands already found, is going to go on for quite a long time. So settler colonialism, in order to establish the national identities of settler nations, must involve some sort of final solution to the so-called Indian problem. And I'm using that term simply because, according to James Q. Whitman, Hitler admired how the United States had, through early massacres and the Indian Removal Act, cleared the land east of the Mississippi of Indigenous peoples and had waged such intensive warfare on the plains. In Canada, on the other hand, as Gary W. Kenny has investigated, members of the South African National Party visited Canada in order to study its regime towards Native peoples and modeled its apartheid regime on Canada's policies of Indigenous containment and racial classification. So our intervention into anti-racism in Canada, with clear arguments as to how this so-called progressive movement was adopting the same measures as a racist society, was enough of an intervention that it brought a number of transformations in how people see their relationship to settler colonialism. Now, relations with Black people developed differently. As far back as the 1980s, the first march addressing the marginalization of both Black people and Indigenous peoples. Remember, less Black people in Canada, even with large-scale Caribbean immigration. So the marginalization of both groups. We didn't actually listen to each other on that first march. Black people were chanting "No justice, no peace." We were playing hand drums and singing. So neither of us were listening to each other. But when we had our rally in Regent's Park, fairly poor area of Toronto, the police were openly filming us. Black Native unity remains as dangerous today as it did during slavery. So we allow these divisions at our peril. Now, other more cohesive marches and conferences have taken place since then. And a truly interesting focus relates to Black conversations on their relationship to indigeneity. There's been ups and downs with Afro-pessimism, you know, not having a particularly salient view of Indigenous peoples. But this conversation taking place in Canada and also in the US include Chad Infante's critique of both Ivan Van Sertima and Sylvia Winters for their tendency to replace Indigenous peoples with Africans. Van Sertima most bluntly with his assumptions about dark-skinned Native peoples being really African. And supplanting Native conceptual ways with African ones. And Sylvia Winters for her theory of the African in Jamaica as the new native of the New World. It brings in mind Palestinian ideas of a land without people for a people without land, you know? So Infante suggests that this desire on the part of diasporic Africa to find an indigeneity in the Americas is the biggest obstacle that he sees to Indigenous Black relations. Sandra Harvey, meanwhile, notes that Black studies in the US is too US-centric in their approach to studying Black life. Quoting Saidia Hartman's passage in Lose Your Mother, where a South African scholar charges, "You think that the story of those in America is most important?" I might add that Hartman entirely ignores the partition of Africa and virtual slavery under colonialism in her approach to Ghana's centrality to the Middle Passage. But in any case, Harvey cautions that Black life should be considered internationally and not just in the United States. Now, these trends are important in considering the notion of living in reciprocity, a concept that is beginning to develop in Canada concerning Native Black relations, which should be even more important in the US, given its larger Black population. However, in the US, it seems that a necessary focus on African-American experiences of both slavery and its afterlife, as Hartman has theorized it, and the realities of Black fungibility, as Tiffany Lethabo King has articulated it, it erases any focus on indigeneity. And indeed, US demographics, Black people are currently 14% of the population, 14 point something. And Native Americans are now up to less than 2%, used to be 0.5%. But it shows how easily this erasure can be affected when one is 14% of the population and the other is less than 2%. And this erasure of Indigenous realities has had important effects on how US history and current realities are understood. I mean, Jody Bird, if the transit of empire can't explain it, I'm not sure what can. Reducing Indigenous peoples to just another kind of racialized body within US anti-racist discourse not only erases Indigenous relationships to land, It obliterates any real focus on the colonial processes through which Indigenous nations were illegally occupied to form the United States. And she argues that indigeneity remains central to the US empire, that a transferable notion of Indianness is central to how US colonialism continues to occupy, expand, and occupy different lands. And any theater of war is still Indian country. So the focus on slavery as African enslavement is also incomplete. Now, not living in the US, my sense of how indigeneity is obscured is largely through a focus on enslavement of African peoples. But it's very incomplete. The enslavement of Indigenous peoples, while Spain rendered it technically illegal, was unstoppable because it was illegal. Now, the primary enslaved workforce in Spanish America was Indigenous, but as Jack Forbes painstakingly researched, it's like pulling teeth to read him. He's so painstaking about it. The capture and selling of native slaves was done by the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, and the French. But the interesting thing is Andreas Resende's book, The Other Slavery, the Uncovered History of Indian Enslavement in America. Now, he's gone through, there's no bills of sale because the transport of Indigenous peoples enslaved was technically illegal. But if you look at all the accounts of people who were visiting and noted the auctions where Indigenous slaves were sold, itemized lists of who was sold at these auctions, this sort of thing. If you really study it the way he did, the result is that between 2.5 million and 5 million Indigenous peoples across the Americas were enslaved between the 16th and 20th centuries. Now, while 12.5 million African people survived the Middle Passage to be enslaved, first in the Caribbean, secondly in Latin America, and only thirdly in the US, his research has found that native enslavement took place at the same order of magnitude as African enslavement. And while the slave trade brought desolation to West Africa and Angola, ruined its economics, the Indigenous slave trade in some places resulted in a 90% population drop, which in the past has been falsely attributed to disease. And while native enslavement has been treated as a small precursor to the African slave trade, instead we find that it existed until the early 20th century. And far from being a minor episode, the comparative numbers are 4 or 5 Black people enslaved for every 1 Indigenous person enslaved. Now, in addressing Indigenous enslavement that way, we're not ignoring the horrors of the Middle Passage, the hundreds murdered in transit on each ship. Toni Morrison says 60 million gone, dying of disease, packed into holds. The reality that going through the door of no return, as Dion Brand so eloquently referenced it, effectively erased African indigeneity. And the afterlife of slavery has meant that having once lived as objects means that your descendants still face the reality of being fundamentally constructed as lacking basic human rights. Which is why Black people continue to be murdered with impunity, despite a global Black Lives Matter movement. But the reality that Indigenous enslavement existed within the same order of magnitude as African enslavement means that the easy erasure of Native peoples as not mattering through an emphasis on slavery needs serious rethinking. But I still have not addressed the question of land and the question of what does race have to do with land. I'm going to begin with the Doctrine of Discovery and the papal bull Romanus Pontifex, which in 1455 granted the New World, as they called it. It was really an old world. The largest cities in the world were in the Americas at the time, And then Spain contested it and was awarded other territories with another papal bull, Inter Caetera, in 1493. So this division left Portugal with Africa and Brazil, and Spain with everything else, including the Caribbean and the Philippines. And the Doctrine of Discovery, by the way, is still being maintained within every settler colonial context where Indigenous rights to land are denied, and Indigenous peoples cannot be part of the UN, for example, because they've been reduced to the internal matters of states that occupy them. So with Romanus Pontifex, Portugal had access to Africa to conquer, enslave, and take the lands of Africans since 1455. But where were those slaves taken before the invasion of the Americas? To Lisbon, and most of them ended up in Seville. They were enslaved according to Mediterranean practices where, as Jane Landers has put it, among other things, slaves had a day a week to work for others to gain money, in addition to time off. They were allowed to marry, and that this did not mean their partners would be sold. They were private and corporate slaves, and they were enslaved with Eastern Europeans, Tartars, Muslims, after 1492, indigenous peoples. So slavery was not race-based in the Mediterranean. And it included the rights of self-representation, where free Black mayors governed Black people, for example. And it's significant that African slaves in Southern Europe were only across the Mediterranean from Africa itself, and yet no slave revolts took place under Mediterranean slavery, probably because enough escape routes were built into it. And some freed Blacks accompanied the conquistadors to the Americas to make their fortunes, while others were brought as slaves. Now, if the Pope had granted papal bulls that said that the peasantry of Southern Europe would be enslaved and have their lands taken, then plantation slavery would have taken place in Europe, and ultimately chattel slavery would have begun there. Until Spain freed up land, chattel slavery could not take place. And they did it first in the Caribbean and Latin America, and later in the United States. And in all places, indigenous lands were invaded, her people enslaved, deported, or murdered. And in this respect, instead of a 1619 project, we need a 1492 project, a project that addresses the massive land theft and enslavement of indigenous peoples that has enabled the Middle Passage and the whole apparatus of the Atlantic slave trade, as well as the enslavement of between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans. But for Native people, it means dispossession, maintaining indigenous removal from the land, murdering the women who reproduce indigeneity. And this is an issue here in the United States as well as in Canada. Turning our lands and bodies into capital to be raped and exploited, destroying those whose bodies represent political orders within indigeneity. Dispossession doesn't just mean removal from the land in that sense, in a more expansive meaning, as Leanne Simpson has articulated. It refers to our loss of knowledge of living on our lands, the theft of the spiritual strength that keeps us strong, even as children were stolen into residential schools. It means removal from our ways of being on the land, and that is settler colonialism in the United States. But because the US is so complex, at once an empire, a place of great internal oppression to huge numbers of people, and a place completely reliant on native land, I'll talk about various forms of colonialism using some examples from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. External colonialism involves the creation of colonial wealth through the extraction and expropriation of valuable aspects of indigenous worlds, animals, plants, minerals, human beings, extracting them in order to transport them to and build the wealth, the privilege, or feed the appetites of colonizers. Through colonial occupation, historically opium, spices, tea, sugar, tobacco, rubber, palm oil, rice, and cotton here in the US, and other commoditized forms of native worlds were extracted through slave labor. And that created most of the wealth that marks the so-called first world countries. And external colonialism, the thing is, it often requires a subset of activities referred to as military colonialism, the creation of war fronts, frontiers against enemies to be conquered, the creation of enemies to be conquered, and the enlistment of foreign lands, resources, and people into military operations. The role of the military in the United States, not only its role in colonial occupation, in how it functions to supply military advisors and suppliers of war globally, and how in doing so it fuels industry in the US to build weapons, provides work in a context where other sectors of the economy have been starved to feed a military machine, and where many people serve in the military in order to acquire an education. The central role of the military in American life is a central aspect of America's role in external colonialism. Internal colonialism involves the biopolitical and geopolitical management of lands, people, flora, and fauna within the domestic borders of the imperial nation. This involves modes of control, prisons, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling, policing, to ensure the ascendancy of a nation and its white elite. These modes of control, now notice that in here, the control of the police is part of internal colonialism, right? And they signify, these modes of control between internal and external signify the difference between the metropole and what's considered her periphery. Most often it's considered a nation and its colonies. Strategies of internal colonialism, such as segregation, surveillance, and criminalization, are both structural and interpersonal. Now, while both of these processes describe aspects of the United States because it's such a complicated country, the organizing factor is settler colonialism, which exists in every land where the colonizer has come to stay. The complexity of the United States means that settler colonialism operates both through internal and external colonial modes, because as a settler nation, there's no spatial separation between the colony and its metropolis, or between a country and its colony. For example, in the US, many Indigenous peoples have been forcibly removed from their homelands into reservations, enslaved, indentured, and abducted into state custody as modes of internal colonialism. Note that Native peoples, I myself challenge that Native peoples are part of a colonial nation. They're not. They may be a third space of sovereignty. They're both within the US and not within the US in that respect. But the control can be manifested in that way. At the same time, uranium mining on Indigenous lands and oil extraction all signify the frontier between Indigenous nations and the settler state. So within settler colonialism, the most important concern is land. It's what's most valued, contested, and required. And it's both because the settlers make the land their home and source of capital, and also because of the disruption of Indigenous relationship to land, which is a profound epistemic, ontological, and cosmological violence. And I might add political violence. And that's why Patrick Wolf emphasizes that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. Colonial event is over once the occupied nation reaches independence and the colonizer goes home. Then it's an event. In the process of settler colonialism, land is remade into property. Human relationships to land are restricted to the relationship of the owner to his property, and it's permanent. The epistemological, ontological, and cosmological relationships that Indigenous peoples have to land are made pre-modern, backward, savage, and political relationships to land are completely denied. That's something that happens more in Canada, where they obscure matters. They say that you can have your cultural rights, but no political rights. But then settler colonialism is more visible in Canada. So colonial settlement, I'm just going to do a little bit more about this, and I'm aware that I have a lot of stuff to go through, so I'll see how it goes. But I mean, colonial settlement on land in the 13 colonies from the start. If you look at the Virginia, charter, they're about holding these lands against all enemies. And as the U.S. became a nation, it moved to free its lands of Indigenous peoples. What the U.S. did with Indigenous peoples in that respect was quite amazing. The Indian Removal Act, relocating hundreds of thousands of people from their lands. And as they moved west, armies were moved against Indigenous peoples. And I'll talk about that later. Other legal assaults on Indigenous nations continued. The Allotment Act of 1885 forced private property and American citizenship on tribes whose collective ways of life had to be destroyed. Each head of family received 120 acres. All other people received 80 acres. All the rest, which ended up being 90% of the land that Indigenous America had held, was gone to white settlers. And that only ended in 1924, when 90% of the land was gone. And surviving tribes that represented any size were reformed into corporate-style governments, which cut them off from the knowledge of elders and pushed a business-like approach to land as commodities on them. And that facilitates resource development by offering these tribes a small slice. After World War II, when Native people fought for the US, they returned to find policies of relocation, paying people to leave the reservation and move to urban spaces. But unlike the homes in the suburbs being provided for white ex-servicemen and the redlining that confined Black people in ways that prevented them from profiting from this suburban boom, Native peoples were relocated to the slums of urban spaces, and once they were moved, they were forgotten. Large numbers of Native people became urban with the relocation policy. Then in the 1950s came termination, the wholesale and completely arbitrary termination of a nation-to-nation relationship. I should mention that when allotment was happening, people fought it. And a Kiowa chief named Lone Wolf brought a case to the Supreme Court of the US, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. In this ruling, which of course the Kiowa Nation lost, The US government ruled that Congress has a plenary power that can terminate treaties at will, because Lone Wolf had challenged allotment by saying that it violated the treaties that they had signed. So that power of Congress to abrogate treaties is there today, and that's how they were able to terminate people. Just the Menominee Reservation ceased to exist for a while. A lot of other nations were terminated. Again, an attempt to divest of any of the power that Native Americans may still have. And then in the 1970s, and with resource wars, attempts to take 1/8 of the Pine Ridge Reservation and develop uranium mining resulted in a petty dictator being placed in power who wouldn't hesitate to murder traditionalists. Apparently, traditionalists were being murdered on the scale that was happening in Chile during the Pinochet regime. And when the American Indian movement intervened, the result was a 70-day standoff at Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre of Lakota people. Facing them were the goons of the corrupt tribal chairman, white vigilantes, and the American military. And veterans said that on some days at Wounded Knee, they saw more firepower than they did in Vietnam. And as I'm speaking, Resolution Copper is planning to take the sacred lands of the Apaches so that a base metal mine can be created. Settler colonialism demands land most of all. And since the Doctrine of Discovery insists that Native occupied lands should be viewed as if they are empty, there's an ongoing push to swallow up all remaining lands that Native peoples have for the oil, gas, uranium, and other minerals found on them. That's settler colonialism in the US. And so the original confusion of what does land mean to anti-racism, because I'd heard that some people were confused about that, it should be reframed as anti-racism is one aspect of a settler colonial framework. In order to address settler colonialism and the dispossession of Indigenous lands, as well as the violence of racism that all racialized people face. Now, understanding the role of settler colonial structures as opposed to focusing on racialized bodies only is above all necessary at Cornell. And I'm not sure if I should be saying this here, but I will be. Cornell is the largest recipient of land of the so-called land grab universities under the Morrill Act. Now, the Morrill Act of 1862, the US began a then novel policy of providing federal support for post-secondary education. Originally, it was for settlers to learn agricultural and the mechanical arts. But the national system of land grant colleges and universities that has developed since then is recognized for its breadth, reach, and excellence in teaching, research, and extension. So land grant institutions are located in every US state and many territories. But we have to see the Morrill Act of 1862 is fundamentally connected not only to the Civil War, but to the warfare waged against Indigenous nations in the so-called winning of the West. Boyd Cothran has addressed how the American Civil War and wars waged against Indigenous peoples in the West, erroneously, I think, called the Indian Wars. They're normally treated as separate entities, but we're in fact entwined. Manifest destiny was a term coined by a reporter after the US acquired the French colonies on the Mississippi. It referred to the growing American belief that the ultimate destiny of the US was an empire reaching all the way to the Pacific, which meant encompassing all of the lands occupied by Indigenous peoples. During the Civil War, the North wanted manifest destiny based on industry and free labor. The South wanted manifest destiny based on slavery. Now, of course, and it was a struggle over the new territories that the US acquired, whether they would be slave or free, but slave meant African slavery. As they acquired New Mexico, they found, slave selling blocks everywhere for native slaves, right? But it was only African slavery that they were concerned with. And that's what caused the South to secede. Now, in the summer of 1862, as Lincoln mulled over the Emancipation Proclamation's details, officials of his administration created the Department of Agriculture, while Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the Homestead Act. And as a result of these acts, federal authorities could offer white citizens a real deal: enlist to fight for Lincoln and liberty and receive as fair recompense for their patriotic sacrifices higher education and Western land connected by rail to markets. In this way, anti-slavery and the growing American empire to be carved out of Indian lands could advance together in lockstep. They were connected. Now, there's a lot here about the Indian Wars. I'm not sure how much people know about them. I'm not sure whether I should be talking about them because in some ways, I believe that in the US, the idea of Native peoples is they're just peoples who were conquered in the past, right? But the important thing is that with the ending of the Civil War, the solution to the problem of demilitarization was to send thousands of troops to the West. And those soldiers became the shock troops of empire. And in a segregated military, 4 divisions of so-called buffalo soldiers were created at that time. As part of dealing with the massive problem of freed slaves who were being offered no 40 acres on a mule after radical Reconstruction ended, no money, no land, no livelihood, just the wages that the army paid, and at segregated rates as well. So, you know, I think I'll pass on that section on the Indian Wars that I talked about. But I'll just mention 2 things: that although the Great Sioux War ended with the loss of the Black Hills, they had surrendered, but the final massacre of the Indian Wars took place at Wounded Knee, December 29th, 1890 on Pine Ridge. And that's the precursor to the siege at Wounded Knee in the 70s. And with the surrender of Chief Joseph and the Wounded Knee massacre, the US had secured its empire in the West. The Indian Wars were over. Expansion of America into new Indian countries was just beginning. So you have to see the Morrill Act, through which Cornell acquired its income, and the power that goes with it, as a result of the North luring people to fight with the promise of higher education as well as land, you know. And that's how the Indian Wars started, because all those men were then diverted west. And it's not only that Cornell has profited from a process that led to the wars against Indigenous peoples in the West, it's that it's profited the most. Cornell received the most land of any US university under the auspices of the Morrill Act, no less than 987,000 acres. It was located in 6,716 parcels across 15 states and 202 counties. By 1914, an estimated 5.7 million had been raised from these lands for the university. And that's about 148 million in current dollars. And as of 1914, they had raised over 4.5 times as much money as the next closest land grant university, Montana State. So, and it's looking like, in preliminary ways, that 167 Indigenous nations and communities were affected by Cornell's acquisition of all this land. And the largest amounts are in California, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So what does race have to do with land? Everything. Concept of race were created during slavery, which could not have flourished without the taking of Indigenous lands. And the reality is that imperialism in the US is part of the framework of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism demands the taking of Indigenous lands and the elimination of the native. The erasure of any knowledge of the US as a settler state and the wealth it acquired from Indigenous lands, just as Cornell's example is evident, through a focus on race based on Blackness and slavery, therefore massively distorts fundamental aspects of US history and what the US stands for. Not democracy, not just slavery, but originally and in an ongoing way, it stands for land theft and settler colonial violence. The Virginia colony, we will hold these lands against the enemy forever. Now, the final concept I want to address, and it's only a page or so, so I'll wrap it up shortly. Patrick Brantlinger's notion of extinction discourse. According to Brantlinger, by the 19th century, it was widely assumed that Indigenous peoples globally were assumed to be incapable of surviving contact with modernity and were doomed to extinction. And these ideas were held at all levels of the settler society, as well as in Europe, until shortly before World War II. And Brantlinger also addressed that extinction discourse was self-serving. Now, it wasn't applied to Africa, both for the large populations, for the fact that that slavery was seen to bring modernity to Black people, so part of the whole racist setup. But extinction discourse was self-serving. If Indigenous people were going to die anyway, why bother letting them keep any of their land? Why bother providing food to those whose food supply had been taken by settlement? It also fed a certain contempt for Native peoples. If they were so weak and irrelevant to progress and modernity and were on the way out, why not hasten matters a little? I would suggest that in the United States today, where a discourse of race that is synonymous with African Americans and which is premised on slavery as the original challenge of American society, and which completely disregards the questions of whose lands have been taken in the process, extinction discourse is still going on. The myth of conquest is really central to many Americans' ideas of who they are, again, breeding a contempt for Indigenous peoples, accompanied sometimes by a romanticized and colonial guilt at the paradise we have destroyed. This is accompanied by a real denial that histories of genocide have any real implications today, even though the wars against Indigenous peoples that took place across the US obviously still resonate. They don't call the theaters of war Indian country for nothing. Most Americans do not consider the colonization of Indigenous peoples to be the first step in a now global American imperialism. Extinction discourse is manifested most thoroughly, though, I think, with the fact that few progressive whites, intellectuals, radicals, whatever, consider that Indigenous peoples count for anything except past conquest. They don't see Indigenous peoples as having anything to say about the important debates about today. Indigenous peoples are only about a pre-contact past and a history of conquest. And in this worldview, the future belongs to white people, Black people, people of color, anybody else but Native peoples. And yet in Canada today, Indigenous peoples have the largest families and are the largest growing demographic group in the country, despite massive immigration. While in the US, the massive concern around border control is largely to keep out the Indigenous peoples of Central America, as well as Mexico, many of whom are Indigenous, preventing Mexicans from being legal citizens and keeping out Indigenous peoples from Central America. Apparently, Hispanics, a term that obscures more than it tells, and Latin Americans are second only to whites demographically in the US. If you add Central Americans and Mexicans, who are like chickens coming home to roost, paraphrasing Malcolm X, for American imperialism having destabilized and occupied Central America for way too long, Indigenous peoples from across the Americas, despite walls and homeland security and everything else, they will eventually manage it across the most militarized border on earth outside of Israeli occupied Palestine, because that's what the American border is, the most militarized zone on earth. Private military, the American military, narco gangs, you name it, it's all there. They're going to make it across, and they will become the largest group in the United States. So something to remember is that contrary to not mattering, across the Americas, the future in both countries belongs to Indigenous peoples. Walalia, Nogamak, all my relations. Thank you. I think I made it to just a little over 45 minutes.
Oh, Bonita, you could sit down and talk all night long. And I think most of us, if not all of us, would sit down and listen to you. Thank you so much for that incredible talk. We're very honored and very grateful. And I'd like to open up now the floor for questions and answers.
Will you do them rather than me having to look at notes?
Yes, of course. Thanks. So, questions? Virtually or in person? Please.
I need to speak here.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think you made like a lot of great points about how one point that you really drove home was how anti-racism is one aspect of the settler colonial framework. So how do you think we should start, maybe not like deconstructing this framework, or like maybe we should start having conversations or more conversations about how like anti-racism needs to be like rethought or needs to be like reprocessed in order to account for like the lost history or account for the erasure of Indigenous people?
I'm struggling with that, with having heard that.
Over here, if you don't mind. I can move it over to you.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so you spoke about one point that was like really interesting, was the idea of like anti-racism is just but one aspect of the settler colonial framework, and how current discussions about anti-racism or movements regarding anti-racism are just kind of embedded in, discourse that erases Indigenous history and erases Indigenous kind of sovereignty or autonomy. How do you think, I guess, maybe like current society, or like maybe we can start with politicians or like grassroots movements, can like deconstruct this framework or maybe like reprocess this framework so that we are held accountable for not doing the same things we are doing like currently when it comes to like ignoring Indigenous stories or ignoring this past, or just only focusing on slavery, specifically African slavery in American history?
Well, I think in some ways, don't forget it's still going on. For example, and what's going on when ongoing settler colonialism, all ongoing occupation of Indigenous lands, is that this climate crisis we're facing continues to escalate. We see it much more in Canada because so much of the north in Canada is occupied primarily by Indigenous peoples, and that's where they're really trying to grab what's left for tar sands, pipelines to bring the oil from tar sands elsewhere, all of the rest of it. So I think that on the one hand, it's not only about understanding the larger history, but the larger present, and that what was it that when they discovered that huge oil discovery on the north slope of Alaska, I can't remember what it's called right now, but when you think of the environmental catastrophes that happen and the global warming that happens with oil development, ignoring what's happening with Native people also means ignoring mining. The good thing was with the Dakota Access Pipeline rallied huge numbers of people, and I think non-natives as well. I know that Native people were there all over the place, but also non-natives were. But that was an example of how a knowledge of settler colonialism means helping to stop things that are going on in the present, as well as understanding the larger role of Indigenous peoples, because it's not just the past. And that's why I didn't bother talking about the Indian Wars, right, as they call them here in the West, because I think that's something that people have an idea about and a guilt about and all of that. But really, it's that this resource theft and rape is still going on, and also that there's solutions that are going on in the U.S. Lots of tribes are doing solar and wind and other resources like that. They're trying to get off the grid, and these are important things for the environment. So it's kind of like, it's not just the past, and it's not just understanding that anti-racism is not just about racialized bodies. It's about a larger picture of settler colonialism and Indigenous lands, by which people can hopefully help to, stop this climate crisis. Haven't got much time left. We have no time left. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonita. There are a few questions online. Let's start with, can you tease out your observation that settler colonialism is more visible in Canada than in the US?
Well, I think there's two things. And one of them is that, unlike in the US, where you will have reserves right next to towns, the British government had a lot more power. They didn't want to spend a lot of money. So for that reason, they piggybacked off of American Manifest Destiny to sign treaties that if you don't sign with us, the Americans are going to come and kill you. That was sort of the thing. So many of Native peoples were forced to settle in the north, right? Some were already based in the north. But it meant that there was a huge segregation between a strip along just north of the US, where most of the white settler society was, and peoples of color. And then the north, which is primarily indigenous. There's still resource towns. Mining took place in certain places, and there's a white settler town there, but most often since you know, some of those reserves are tapped out, those become virtually empty towns. So you have a situation where there are large areas in the north which are all mineral rich, and which Canada, they have comprehensive claims. So you'll sign up and give your rights away in exchange for a little bit of something to keep going. So it is a little bit more obvious, in part also because the discourse of slavery doesn't obscure indigeneity to such an extent, but also because the segregation of reserves far away, as they saw it from white settlement, means that those lands, it used to be that, well, back in the 1970s, there was a James Bay hydro development project, largely to sell hydro to the US. And it created a reservoir that you can see from the moon. That's how big it was, right? They didn't even bother to tell Cree people and Inuit people that they were doing it. You know, they just moved in and started building. So that's the kind of thing that has happened in Canada and continues to happen. So I think that's why it's a little more obvious. You know, there's been whole areas of the US that have been settled by whites. Appalachia, which used to be coal mining, you know, despite Trump's attempts to revive coal mining, it's dead there. But there's areas where environmental racism goes on, where resource projects happen around non-Indigenous peoples. In Canada, it's pretty much the line of Indigenous peoples is where the destruction of the land and the destruction of the environment and climate change is happening. We had a movement called Shut Down Canada. Just before COVID shut down Canada, huge numbers of non-natives. What happened was the Wet'suwet'en people were blocking pipelines to go through to British Columbia through the mountains. They had a little pipeline and they were massively expanding it and they were fighting it. Plus there was all kinds of other developments. So they stood up for it. They were all arrested because of course the Canadian military and the security agencies are all involved. And because of that, a group at Tyendinaga, it's a Mohawk community, that they were moved north after the American Revolution because they fought for Britain and in the process lost their lands in the US. So that community has a railroad right through it. But that's the problem in Canada. They ran all the resources through native lands. So native peoples are considered a high security threat in Canada. There's army manuals about how to deal with native insurgency. Anyway, Tyendinaga blocked a major railroad corridor between Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, which are the sort of the big three, you know, places with the most commuter traffic. They blockaded it for like a month or so. And because it's on reserve land, it's harder for them to stop it. And in the process, non-natives occupied the port of Vancouver for like ages. They were just like, we're going to stop Canada from functioning. And it went on. I mean, sometimes you could only seize things for a day. Otherwise, you'd all be arrested constantly. But they obstructed things for month after month, right? It was fascinating. It was wonderful. And then, of course, COVID came along, and then Canada classified resource development as a necessary industry. And we were all in our homes. So, yeah, I hope that helps.
Mohammed?
Yes, Samiha, please.
Yes. Hi there, Professor Lawrence. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this discussion. And thank you, everyone, for the audio. So this is kind of a vague question, but just in thinking about indigeneity and ethnicity and ties to land and identity, and also in recognition of the ongoing and continuous genocide of relationships to land, I'm wondering if you have specific thoughts on how collective identity might be resolved through relationships to land in the present day, especially considering, you know, the long arm of the state continues to exist and perpetuate its various modes of control. So, yeah, are there ways that you see that an ongoing identity to land can kind of mitigate state disrupture?
It's funny that my first my PhD thesis was called, which became a book called Real Indians and Others: Mixed Race Urban Native People and Indigenous Indigenous, not sovereignty, Indigenous. I can't remember the term. I'm tired. But it was all about how can over 50% of Indigenous peoples, both in Canada and the US, I think, are urban. How can you resolve land, especially if you're off territory like I am, right? I live around Ojibwe people all the time. So, and the others, are you talking about Indigenous peoples generally, or access to land for peoples, you're talking about Indigenous people specifically?
Right? I think more general, just, relationships to land for racialized peoples. Yeah. Well, it's funny, I was talking about this in my Indigenous theory class this morning. Especially the idea that people who have worked the land intergenerationally under conditions of slavery, that matters, and the difficulty for the US is that the nations who I had all this in my paper, and I removed it because I figure I had to focus more on settler colonialism. But the fact that it started with the Carolina colony inducing one group to sell their war captives. People captured. It was a form of slavery, but it was about, are you going to kill everybody you've been at war with, or will you keep them? Anyway, they began selling their war captives to the Carolina colony. And that, I think, once one little group did it, it became a source of selling people. And that's why it was really 4 nations in the Southeast who undertook enslaved Africans. So the problem is that that's one area where I think that land belongs to those who worked it, but it should be done in conjunction with the peoples who were removed from it. But in the case of the Southeast, you have the people who then enslaved Africans. So it's a real mess. Relations between Indigenous and Black peoples in that area. But I do think part of the problem with, and I do see it happening outside of the Southeast, or the South as it's called, I guess, that peoples are starting to try and form relationships to land. It really does need to be done in conjunction, I think, with local Indigenous peoples. That's how it's happening, in Canada. Like there's some people who have settled on some land, actually about 200 kilometers away. And they've done it through discussions with Anishinaabe people, right? And therefore it's kind of like, yes, you can use this land. So I think that that's part of the way that it can happen. As I say, the big problem is I think that a lot of the people who left the South because they couldn't stand, the violence of racial domination, of racial terror, that in some degree, that land should belong to the people who worked it. But the discussions with Indigenous peoples who were there and were removed, and many of them were enslaved and ceased to exist. Hundreds of nations ceased to exist because of that trade with Carolina. What they would do is they started with this group called the Westo. They were pushed out of Canada because of mercantile struggles there. So they had no alliances, no friends. Carolina wanted a new source of wealth, said, will you sell us your war captives? And they did, because they were desperate. And once they started selling their war captives, and then Carolina would ship them out and sometimes exchange them for Africans, that went on for 50 years. It stopped any importation of Africans, more than a few people, into the US for 50 years. And that's what corrupted the Eastern nations. If you're selling your own war slaves, who else can you buy and sell? So, but I think that, if people want to develop a relationship to the land, they really do need to do it in conjunction with Indigenous peoples. And outside of the South, it's easier, right? Because you don't have this massive problem
of the nations that enslaved Africans and then were removed, right? So I don't know if that helps, but I think it's important. I was doing, for my PhD, was looking at how urban Native people, especially people who are off territory and people who've lost their connections through loss of Indian status, because the way that identity is regulated here is different from the US, but the same result. So, you know, how do we begin to make relationships to land, right? So I think it's a question for non-natives and for racialized people, especially for Black people whose indigeneity was taken through the door of no return. Yeah, but it should be done in conjunction with Indigenous peoples outside of the South.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sama. We have another question. Has there been research on lynchings of Indigenous people in the US and in connection to land struggles?
On lynchings, did you say?
Yes.
No, actually, there was some lynching in Canada, in British Columbia, that the government has just apologized for. They're good at apologizing and doing nothing. But I haven't heard of that. You know, removal was, so many peoples were just removed. I mean, before that, peoples were enslaved and gotten rid of that way, you know, moved and enslaved somewhere else. But I don't think there's been, no, I think that lynching was a particular racial terror. Don't forget, the US declared war on Native peoples in the West because they had horses from the Spanish and they were armed. They were a big risk. Native peoples in the East had already been largely removed. Some hid in Black communities and became Black. Some you know, hid in white communities and became white. Some survived. But you had this large group of Black people to subordinate, you know, of freed Black people. So you had to re-enslave and lynch and, you know, have them working in coal mines and under slave conditions or chain gangs or lynching. Yeah, it wasn't done for Native people. You know, only in BC where there's large numbers of fairly militant Native peoples at the time that they did hang a couple of people, but that was, no.
Thank you, Bonita. Another question. You mentioned the university as spaces that are built on the theft of Indigenous lands. What should be the role of universities today, considering the necessity for decolonization?
Well, universities that have received land from Indigenous peoples there has to be restitution, right? In whatever way it happens, the peoples who were affected by all that money that universities got from the land grant, from the Morrill Act, that's a question of restitution, right? Yeah, and I like what Krista says. I know who she is. Yeah, return it. The question is, you know, yeah, restitution, and whatever way that is, whether it's returning, it needs to be returning a lot of it, if not all of it, you know, because restitution gets offered like money, and land is what things are worth. So. Thank you, Krista.
Yes.
She's somebody I know.
She's somebody we both know. Would you be willing to share your perspective on the land back movement?
It's wonderful. I'm not sure what else to say. I mean, it's wonderful, and because of that, it's criminalized. Now, I don't think land back is happening in the US. I may be wrong, but in Canada, because it's so effective, it's because what in Canada, because Indigenous peoples are a relatively larger percentage and have much more land still, much more of a threat. There's all kinds of ways of tying people up in courts and making them believe that if they jump through enough hoops, they will somehow benefit, right? And those ways of ensnaring people get them to think of land as real estate, right? Like the Dene Nation. Glenn Coulthard is a theorist who has addressed the Dene peoples who occupied much of the Northwest Territories in Canada. Basically, for years, resisted Canada's attempts to kind of take the land, and were proposing instead, no, we will maintain much of it ourselves. We'll allow the settlers to have some of it, and we will have the rest. They all got corrupted into the comprehensive claim policy, where you sign over your land in exchange for a little bit of it. And now they see land as real estate. So Canada is so good at finding ways of getting people to negotiate, and in the process do what they want, that land back is really like, okay, we're walking away from this dysfunctional relationship and we're going to get our land back. And the problem is, of course, is because it's the most effective way, it's the most policed. It's the one where the RCMP, has files, where the Canadian military has a handbook to deal with activists. And don't forget, because Canada put all its infrastructure across native lands, they appropriated lands everywhere, to put railroads across it, to put hydro lines across it. All of that is vulnerable. So it's an excuse to assert more violence. So land back is one of the only ways, is the only way that Indigenous peoples can actually protect their lands. And that's why it's the one way in which you will draw down the force of, if not the RCMP, then the military,
Thank you, Bonita. One more question. Miigwech, for your time and knowledge, can you speak to the in-betweenness situation of people of mixed ancestry, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, especially those who are white passing?
Well, regulation of Native identity is everything in these contexts. If you possess Indian status in Canada, or if you're a member of a federally recognized tribe and are a tribal member in the US, it doesn't matter how mixed blood you are, right? It's the people such as myself who are non-status, who at present, there's a real attack. I think there's been identity wars all over the US for a long time, the wannabe situation. Here in Canada, it's becoming particularly virulent. I'm on a list. Apparently 40 of us from Toronto universities have now belatedly been called pretendians, right? So it becomes very difficult. People are constantly challenging your right to acknowledge yourself as Indigenous. And yet, ironically, because so many people intermarried after World War II, elders are always telling us, you have to decide who you are. Are you Native? Are you non-Native? You can't sit in the middle, right? So that's changing now. And it has a lot to do with certain actors who are, the Indian hunters, the sniffing out so-called pretendians, those people. So there's that going on. In terms of identity itself, it's, so many people are mixed blood now. It really is a matter of whether you have Indian status or not. And if you're off territory, it's particularly difficult. Like, I don't get challenged in the Maritimes. I get challenged here in Toronto, or I'm not in Toronto, I'm in Eastern Ontario, but Toronto is a place where people get challenged a lot because they don't necessarily know who you are, I don't know if that's what you were referring to, because, it doesn't have to mean much, A lot of people reject if if they're allowed to take part in the life of their nation because they still have access to the land in their community, then mixed blood doesn't matter at all. Where it does matter, aside from all of this violence that's going on now about controlling, you know, who counts and who doesn't as an Indigenous person, really it matters if you can access land, I think. Other than that, a lot of people I know consider themselves a racially mixed person who's Indigenous. That's what I how I've termed myself. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
I think so, but I have to wait and see.
Yeah, because I'm not sure if the mixed blood part was about, you know, not fitting in generally, or was it, you know, as I say, a lot. One of the things I think to remember is that if you take away people, remove them from the land, and then send them to residential school so they don't access their language, or they, like in my mother's case, you know, religious educated and a lot of racism, and then you take away their language, take away their land, what's left is an Indian card. You know, not for older people. Older people generally see more than that, but increasingly for, you know, today's generations of younger people, you know, the Indian card is all that's left.
Thank you, Bonita. Any other questions? Online, offline? Well, with that, leave you at peace. Thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence, for your labor, for your time, for your knowledge, for joining us on this wonderful evening. We wish you were present here in person. And yeah, thank you so much.
I hope our paths can cross soon on a personal note. It'd be really nice.
I miss you very much. I miss you very much.
Thank you so much, eh? You take care.
Thank you. For those who are still interested, prior to obviously a round of applause for Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you.
For those who are still interested, we'll be having upcoming events with the Einaudi Center, hopefully next term. Dr. Jesper Poor, Harsha Walia, as well as other speakers like Dr. Jody Bird, Juliana Hugh, as well as Dana Alwan. We have Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, as well as Dr. Catherine McKittrick. So we have quite a few events lined up, so please stay tuned in. And thank you so much for your audience, you know, virtually and those present here again. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Bonita. Assalamu alaikum. Miigwech.
Miigwech.